A man believed he was saving lives by adopting a boy and offering him luxury and prestige, but to keep the biological mother close by, he hid her under the guise of a maid. Years later, the son grew up arrogant, despising the very person who loved him most. One day the man saw the boy humiliating the maid, unaware that she was his own mother, and what he did was shocking. If this story interested you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us what city you're watching us from. We'll keep going. The harsh winter wind swept through the streets of Greenwich, Connecticut, as Sarah Johnson clutched her 2-year-old son Ethan tighter against her chest. Her threadbare coat offered little protection against the biting cold, but her concern wasn't for herself. The toddler's cheeks were flushed red, his tiny body trembling despite being wrapped in the only blanket she owned. For 3 days, they had survived on nothing but crackers and water in an abandoned building near the harbor. Sarah had lost her waitressing job, then their apartment, and now pneumonia threatened her son's life. "Just hang on, baby," she whispered, tears freezing on her cheeks as she walked the final block to Greenwich Hospital. She had avoided this moment for days, knowing what might happen when the authorities discovered their situation. But Ethan's labored breathing left her no choice. Inside the emergency room, warmth enveloped them as a nurse rushed forward. "This child needs immediate attention," the woman called out, taking Ethan from Sarah's trembling arms. "Please help him," Sarah begged, her voice breaking. "I don't have insurance, but I'll do anything." The next hours passed in a blur of medical terms and concerned glances. Sarah sat in the waiting area, her head in her hands, praying for a miracle she couldn't afford. She didn't notice the tall, distinguished man who entered the hospital, nor did she hear his conversation with the hospital administrator. Richard Montgomery, CEO of Montgomery Investments and one of Greenwich's most powerful residents, had arrived for his monthly board meeting when he overheard a conversation about the homeless mother and her critically ill child. At 45, Richard had achieved everything money could buy, except the family he'd always wanted. His wife had died of cancer 5 years earlier, leaving him childless and alone in his 20-room mansion overlooking Long Island Sound. Despite his wealth and influence, emptiness followed him like a shadow. When the doctor finally approached Sarah, his expression was grave. "Your son is stabilizing, but he needs ongoing care, proper nutrition, and a warm environment. Ms. Johnson, I'm obligated to contact social services given your current situation." Sarah's world collapsed around her. "Please don't take my baby," she whispered, knowing her pleas were futile. "There might be another option." The voice came from behind her. Sarah turned to see a man in an impeccable suit, his silver-streaked dark hair and confident posture marking him as someone accustomed to power. "Richard Montgomery," he introduced himself, extending his hand. "May I speak with you privately?" In a small consultation room, Richard made an offer that would change their lives forever. "I've been looking to adopt a child," he explained, his eyes revealing a loneliness that even his wealth couldn't disguise. "I can give your son everything. The best medical care, education, opportunities you can't imagine." Sarah's heart shattered. "He's all I have." "I understand," Richard said, leaning forward, "which is why I'm proposing something unconventional. I need a new housekeeper at my estate. The position includes living quarters, meals, healthcare benefits." Hope flickered in Sarah's eyes. "You could see your son grow up," Richard continued, "be part of his life." "As what? His mother?" Sarah asked. Richard's expression shifted. "That's the condition. Legally, he would be my son. You would be an employee in the household. Nothing more." The cruelty of the proposition hit Sarah like a physical blow. "You want me to pretend I didn't give birth to him? Watch someone else raise my child?" "I'm offering you both a chance at life," Richard countered. "Look at your situation objectively. Your son needs immediate stability. I can provide that. You can remain in his life, or—" He left the alternative unspoken. Outside, snow began falling again as Sarah stared through the window, tears streaming down her face. "Would I ever be able to tell him the truth?" "When he's older, perhaps. When the time is right," Richard answered, though his tone suggested otherwise. "But for now, a clean break would be best for everyone. He's young enough that he won't remember." Sarah visited Ethan's bedside, watching his peaceful sleep, now aided by proper medication and warmth. She touched his soft cheek, remembering the day he was born. how she'd promised to give him the world. Now keeping that promise meant giving him up. 3 days later, papers were signed. Richard Montgomery legally adopted Ethan Johnson, who became Ethan Montgomery. Sarah moved into the staff quarters of Montgomery Estate, working as a housekeeper under the watchful eye of Mrs. Peterson, the stern head of household staff. "Remember your place," Mrs. Peterson warned on Sarah's first day, having been briefed by Richard about the unusual arrangement. "Mr. Montgomery has been incredibly generous. Don't make him regret it." Richard established the ground rules clearly. Sarah would have Sundays off and could occasionally interact with Ethan during her normal duties, but never alone, and never with any hint of maternal affection. To the child in the world, she would be simply Sarah, another invisible servant maintaining the Montgomery lifestyle. The first year was unbearable. Sarah would fold Ethan's tiny clothes, prepare his meals, and sometimes catch glimpses of him playing with the nanny Richard had hired, a qualified early childhood educator who received twice Sarah's salary. At night, she would silently enter his room during her cleaning rounds, watching him sleep for precious stolen minutes, fighting the urge to gather him into her arms. Richard, for his part, threw himself into fatherhood with unexpected dedication. He rearranged his schedule to spend mornings and evenings with Ethan, read him bedtime stories, and documented every milestone with expensive camera equipment. From his perspective, he was saving 2 lives, giving Ethan opportunities he would never have had, and providing Sarah with security she couldn't have achieved on her own. But in his benevolence, Richard failed to see the psychological toll of his arrangement. As Ethan began speaking, calling him Daddy with adoration, Sarah would retreat to her small room and muffle her sobs in her pillow. When he took his first steps across the manicured lawn, reaching for Richard's outstretched hands instead of hers, something inside her began to crack. By Ethan's 3rd birthday, the household had settled into its carefully choreographed routine. Richard hosted an extravagant party with the children of Greenwich's elite, while Sarah worked alongside caterers, setting up decorations and serving cake. When Ethan stumbled and scraped his knee, it was Mrs. Peterson who swooped in to comfort him, shooting Sarah a warning glance when she instinctively moved toward her crying child. That night, after the guests had departed and Ethan was tucked into bed surrounded by new toys, Richard found Sarah cleaning up the remnants of the celebration in the garden. "He's happy," Richard said, as if offering her a gift. "You made the right choice." Sarah looked up, her expression carefully neutral, though her eyes burned with unspoken grief. "Did I have a choice, Mr. Montgomery?" Richard's confidence faltered momentarily. "You both would have ended up in the system. He would have been taken from you anyway. And this is better," Sarah asked quietly, gathering colorful paper plates. "Watching him grow up calling another person parent while I scrub his floors." "He has everything he could ever want," Richard insisted. "And you get to be near him. Most birth mothers in your situation never see their children again." The term birth mother stung like a slap. Sarah straightened, years of suppressed dignity rising to the surface. "Is that what you tell yourself to sleep at night, Mr. Montgomery? That your money justifies everything?" For a moment, something like doubt crossed Richard's face. But he was a man accustomed to believing in his own righteousness. "I'm giving him a future. Sarah, something you couldn't provide." As he walked away, Sarah whispered to herself, "But I could have given him love without conditions." The words were lost in the evening breeze, carrying away the first tears she had allowed herself to shed publicly since the arrangement began. Inside his study, Richard poured himself a whiskey and gazed at the framed adoption certificate on his wall. He had done a good thing, he was certain, saved a child from poverty, given a desperate mother a lifeline. If the arrangement felt uncomfortably like ownership sometimes, he pushed those thoughts aside. After all, intentions mattered more than appearances, didn't they? 11 years passed like chapters in a book that Sarah wasn't allowed to read fully. She watched from the periphery as Ethan transformed from a toddler into a handsome 13-year-old boy who carried himself with the confidence that came from never knowing want or rejection. His dark hair, so much like hers, was always perfectly styled for his exclusive private school. His wardrobe changed with the seasons and designer collections, while Sarah still wore the same 3 sets of uniforms Richard provided for the household staff. Greenwich Academy had molded Ethan into the perfect heir for the Montgomery legacy. He excelled in academics, played lacrosse and tennis, and had begun showing interest in the financial markets that had built his father's fortune. His childhood bedroom with cartoon characters had evolved into a sophisticated teen suite, with the latest technology and sports memorabilia signed by professional athletes who occasionally dined at Richard's table. Sarah had also changed. The desperate young mother had hardened into a quiet, efficient housekeeper who kept her eyes downcast and her emotions buried. She had earned Mrs. Peterson's reluctant respect through sheer determination and meticulous work. The other staff members knew nothing of her connection to Ethan. Richard had fabricated a story about hiring her through an agency, and her background remained a carefully guarded secret. "Sarah, I need these shirts pressed for tomorrow's presentation," Ethan called out one afternoon, tossing his school uniform carelessly onto the hallway floor as he texted on his phone. "And Dad wants you to prepare the guest rooms. Some investors are coming for dinner." "Yes, Mr. Ethan," Sarah replied automatically, bending to collect the discarded clothes. She had learned to make herself invisible, to speak only when spoken to, especially around her son. "Oh, and there's a stain on my lacrosse jersey. I need it clean by tomorrow's game." He didn't look up from his phone, didn't see the way her fingers lingered on the fabric that had touched his skin. "I'll take care of it," she answered, fighting the urge to remind him about the laundry hamper they'd discussed last week. That wasn't her place anymore. She had surrendered that right along with her identity as his mother. Later that evening, Sarah polished silverware in the kitchen while listening to Ethan practice piano in the adjacent music room. The Chopin nocturne floated through the house, his talent undeniable. She remembered how he had banged happily on pots and pans as a toddler, showing early signs of musical aptitude that Richard had cultivated with the finest instructors. "His recital is next weekend," Mrs. Peterson commented, entering with a stack of linen napkins. "Mr. Montgomery has invited half of Greenwich. He plays beautifully," Sarah murmured, allowing herself this small acknowledgement of pride. "Well, don't get any ideas about attending," the older woman warned. "Staff isn't invited to these functions unless they're working. Mr. Montgomery wants extra hands for serving, so you'll be on duty." Sarah nodded, having expected nothing less. She had watched Ethan's birthdays, school performances, and sports games from a distance for years, polishing trophies he won but never celebrating with him, preparing his favorite meals but never sitting at the table to share them. On the other side of the estate, Richard sat in his home office reviewing Ethan's college investment portfolio, while the boy lounged on the leather sofa, scrolling through social media. "Madison invited me to her family's place in Aspen for spring break," Ethan mentioned casually. "Her father has a private jet. Can I go?" Richard looked up from his computer. "The Wallaces? Interesting. Their hedge fund has been outperforming expectations lately." He considered the political advantages of strengthening connections with the Wallace family. "We'll discuss it. Have you finished your history paper?" "Almost. I had Sarah type up my notes," Ethan replied with a shrug. "She's good for that stuff." Something in his tone made Richard pause. "Ethan, the household staff deserves your respect. They work hard to make our lives comfortable." Ethan rolled his eyes. "I know, Dad. You give the same speech every time. Privilege comes with responsibility. I get it. Do you?" Richard challenged mildly. "Because I've noticed how you speak to Sarah lately. There's a difference between giving instructions and giving orders. She's a maid." "Dad, that's literally her job, to take orders." Richard set down his pen, uncomfortable with his son's dismissive attitude. "She's a person first, Ethan. Someone who has dedicated years to this household." "Whatever," Ethan muttered, returning to his phone. "Tyler says his family just got a new yacht. Can we upgrade ours this summer? Theirs has a helipad." The conversation shifted to material acquisitions, the moment of potential character building lost. Richard had tried to instill values of humility and gratitude in his son, but Greenwich society worked against him. Ethan's friends measured worth by possessions and pedigree, and despite Richard's occasional lectures, the boy had absorbed these values like oxygen. Meanwhile, Sarah moved through the house like a ghost, dusting photographs that documented a life she had given birth to, but wasn't permitted to shape. Family vacations in Bali, skiing in Switzerland, sailing in the Mediterranean. moments captured in expensive frames that formed a pictorial history from which she was conspicuously absent. Occasionally she would find evidence of herself in the background, a blurred figure carrying luggage or arranging flowers, present but peripheral. The worst moments came when Richard hosted dinner parties and Sarah served guests who commented on the striking resemblance between father and adopted son. "He has your bearing. Richard," they would say, or "he certainly inherited your business acumen." Richard would smile modestly, accepting compliments for genetics that weren't his, while Sarah silently refilled water glasses, the only person in the room who knew that Ethan's mathematical brilliance came from her father, a physics professor, whose career had been cut short by illness, or that his distinctive laugh mirrored her brother's. On Ethan's 13th birthday, Richard gifted him with a custom Rolex watch, engraved with the Montgomery family crest. "Your first real timepiece," he announced proudly at the lavish party. "A Montgomery tradition." Sarah watched from the kitchen doorway as Ethan's eyes widened with delight. She had saved for months to buy him a simple leather-bound journal, remembering how he used to create stories as a young child. She had left it on his bed that morning with a card signed simply "From Sarah," knowing anything more intimate would cross the boundaries Richard had established. Later that night, she found the journal discarded in the trash while cleaning his room. The card had been torn in half, her small gift deemed unworthy of acknowledgement. Fighting back tears, she retrieved it, smoothing the leather cover with trembling fingers before hiding it in her quarters. That evening, Richard found Sarah in the laundry room, methodically folding Ethan's clothes. "The party was a success," he commented, leaning against the doorframe. Ethan was thrilled with the watch. "It was very generous," Sarah replied neutrally, focusing on perfectly aligning the sleeves of an expensive sweater. Richard studied her for a moment. "He's doing exceptionally well at school. The headmaster thinks he might be valedictorian material in a few years." Sarah allowed herself a small smile. "He's always been bright." "Yes," Richard agreed, an awkward pause stretching between them. After 13 years, these moments still occurred, the unspoken acknowledgement of their unusual arrangement hanging in the air like an uninvited guest. "I've been thinking," Richard continued, clearing his throat. "Ethan's getting older. Perhaps it's time we considered telling him about the situation." Sarah's hands stilled on the laundry. "After all this time?" "He's mature enough now to understand the circumstances," Richard suggested, though his tone lacked conviction. "It might be better coming from me, of course." Hope fluttered in Sarah's chest for the first time in years. "When?" Richard straightened his posture, retreating back into his role as employer. "I'll need to find the right moment. These things are delicate." "Perhaps after his exams." Sarah nodded, knowing better than to press. Richard had dangled this possibility before, usually when guilt momentarily overcame his commitment to the narrative he'd constructed. "Thank you, Mr. Montgomery," she said quietly, returning to her folding. Richard lingered for a moment longer, then left without another word. In his study, he poured himself a scotch and gazed out at the manicured grounds, wondering if he had made the right decision all those years ago. Ethan had everything a child could want, except the truth. And Sarah. Richard rarely allowed himself to contemplate the full weight of what he had asked of her. To exist in the shadow of her own child's life, to suppress every maternal instinct, to watch another person claim the milestones and memories that should have been partly hers. He told himself it was necessary, that it was for Ethan's stability and well-being. But on nights like this, doubt crept in like the tide, impossible to ignore. What neither Richard nor Sarah realized was that their carefully maintained facade was about to fracture, and the catalyst would be Ethan himself, the boy who had grown up in luxury, but with an inexplicable emptiness he couldn't name, a hunger no amount of privilege could satisfy. Spring arrived in Greenwich with an explosion of cherry blossoms and freshly mulched garden beds. The Montgomery estate underwent its annual transformation as landscapers sculpted hedges and planted thousands of tulips along the winding driveway. Sarah had always loved this season. The rebirth after winter's dormancy reminded her that even the most barren periods eventually gave way to new life. She was tending to the herb garden outside the kitchen, the one small corner of the grounds that was unofficially hers to maintain, when the sound of breaking glass shattered the morning quiet. Sarah looked up to see Ethan and 3 of his friends from Greenwich Academy emerging from the pool house laughing raucously. "Dude, your dad's going to kill you," said Tyler Bennett, the lankiest of the group, as he pointed to the shattered remnants of what appeared to be an expensive crystal decanter. "Whatever," Ethan replied with the casual dismissal of someone who had never faced real consequences. "The staff will clean it up." He caught sight of Sarah kneeling in the garden and called out, "Hey, there's broken glass by the pool. Take care of it before my father sees." Sarah slowly stood, brushing soil from her uniform. "I'll get the broom, Mr. Ethan," she replied evenly. "Make it quick," he said, turning back to his friends, "and bring some sodas out while you're at it. The imported ones, not the regular stuff." As Sarah retrieved cleaning supplies from the utility closet, she could hear the boys' conversation drifting through the open windows. They were comparing summer plans. The Bennetts were chartering a yacht in the Greek islands. The Wallaces had rented a castle in Scotland, and the Gardners were doing a safari in Tanzania. "Dad's taking me to tour the Asian markets," Ethan was saying as Sarah returned with a dustpan and brush. "He says it's time I start understanding global investments firsthand." "Boring," commented Tyler. "My dad says your dad works too much. That's why he's still single." Sarah kept her head down as she carefully collected the glass fragments. The boys continued talking as if she were invisible. A piece of furniture rather than a person with ears and feelings. "Speaking of single," another boy chimed in, "Madison Wallace was asking about you at lacrosse practice yesterday." Sarah could hear the smile in Ethan's voice. "Madison's hot, but her father's connections are what matter to my dad." "Smart thinking, Montgomery. Combine business with pleasure," the boys laughed, their privileged confidence grating against Sarah's nerves as she gathered the last shards of glass. "Hey, you missed a piece," Ethan suddenly called out, pointing to a tiny fragment glinting in the sunlight. Sarah moved to retrieve it, but Ethan's foot deliberately stepped in her path, causing her to stumble slightly. "Careful there," he said, his voice carrying an undercurrent of mockery that made his friends snicker. "We wouldn't want to have to replace you." Something inside Sarah, a dam holding back 13 years of suppressed maternal authority, threatened to break. She looked up, meeting her son's eyes directly for the first time in years. "There's no need to be unkind, Mr. Ethan," she said quietly. The teenager's expression hardened. "Excuse me?" "I said there's no need for unkindness," Sarah repeated, her voice steadier than she felt. "Your father taught you better manners than that." The pool area fell silent. Ethan's friends exchanged uncomfortable glances, unaccustomed to seeing staff challenge their social superiors. "Did you just try to parent me?" Ethan asked incredulously, his cheeks flushing. "You're the help. You don't get to comment on my behavior." Sarah's heart constricted at the contempt in his voice, but she maintained her composure. "Everyone deserves basic respect, regardless of their position." "You know what?" Ethan said, stepping closer, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "My father only keeps you around because he feels sorry for you. He told me you were some charity case he took in years ago." The words struck like physical blows. Sarah felt the color drain from her face as she absorbed this revelation, that Richard had discussed her with Ethan, but only as an object of pity, erasing even the dignity of her professional competence. "I apologize for overstepping," she managed to say, her voice barely audible as she gathered her cleaning supplies. "I'll bring your sodas right away." As she turned to leave, Ethan deliberately kicked over the dustpan, sending the glass fragments scattering across the stone patio. "Actually, you missed some spots," he said loudly, causing his friends to erupt in laughter. "Let us start over." Sarah stood frozen, the humiliation washing over her in waves. Through the French doors, she caught a glimpse of Richard watching from his study window, his expression unreadable. Their eyes met briefly before he turned away, closing the curtains on the scene below. That evening, after Ethan's friends had departed, Richard summoned Sarah to his study. She stood before his desk, hands clasped, eyes fixed on a point just above his shoulder. "I saw what happened by the pool today," he began, arranging papers on his desk to avoid looking directly at her. "I apologize for speaking out of turn," Sarah replied automatically. "It won't happen again." Richard sighed, leaning back in his leather chair. "That's not..." Ethan's behavior was unacceptable. "I've spoken to him about it." Sarah said nothing, the wound of Ethan's revelation still fresh. After a moment of uncomfortable silence, she asked, "Did you tell him I was a charity case?" Richard had the grace to look ashamed. "I may have implied something similar when he asked why you've been with us so long. I thought it would prevent further questions." "I see." The simple acknowledgement contained volumes of hurt. "Sarah, this arrangement has always been complicated," Richard continued, his tone softening slightly. "Ethan is at a difficult age. Teenagers push boundaries, test limits." "He's becoming cruel," Sarah said, finally meeting Richard's gaze. "Not just to me, but have you heard how he talks about others? The entitlement in his voice?" Richard shifted uncomfortably. "He's under a lot of pressure. Greenwich Academy, his extracurriculars, maintaining the Montgomery reputation." "He humiliated me in front of his friends," Sarah interrupted, surprising them both with her directness. "And you watched it happen?" The accusation hung in the air between them. Richard stood, moving to the bar cart to pour himself a drink, buying time to formulate a response. "What would you have had me do?" he finally asked. "Rush outside and undermine his authority? Create a scene?" "His authority," Sarah repeated, incredulous. "He's 13 years old. He shouldn't have authority over adults who care for him." Richard took a long sip of his scotch. "This situation requires delicate balance. Sarah, we agreed to certain terms." "No, you dictated terms to a desperate mother who had no choice," Sarah corrected him. "Years of resentment crystallizing into cold clarity. And now my son looks through me like I'm furniture and treats me with contempt while you watch from behind glass." "I've given him everything," Richard responded defensively. "Education, opportunities, connections." "Except compassion," Sarah finished. "Except the understanding that worth isn't measured by bank accounts or last names." Richard slammed his glass down. "That's unfair. I've tried to instill values. By allowing him to believe he's superior to the people who serve him?" Sarah challenged. "By teaching him that money justifies cruelty? What values are those exactly?" For once, Richard seemed at a loss for words. The perfectly constructed world he had built was showing fissures, and he had no blueprint for repairs. "I think it's time we told him the truth," Sarah said into the silence. "Before it's too late." Richard's expression hardened. "That's not your decision to make." "Then whose is it?" Sarah asked, a tremor in her voice betraying her emotion. "Because while we've been maintaining this charade, my child has turned into someone who finds joy in humiliating others. Is that the son you wanted?" Richard turned to the window, gazing out at the manicured grounds that represented everything he had achieved. "He's not ready," he said finally. "The revelation would destabilize him, affect his schoolwork, his social standing." "His social standing," Sarah echoed hollowly. "Of course. Heaven forbid Greenwich society discover that Ethan Montgomery's mother scrubs their toilets." "That's enough," Richard said sharply. "You're upset, and understandably so. Ethan will apologize for his behavior, and we'll move forward." "Move forward," Sarah repeated, the fight suddenly draining from her. "We've been moving forward for 13 years, Mr. Montgomery, and look where it's led us." She turned to leave, but Richard's voice stopped her at the door. "Sarah," he said, his tone gentler now, "I know this isn't what you envisioned, but consider the alternative. You would have lost him completely in the foster system. At least this way you've been part of his life." Sarah looked back, her expression a complex mixture of gratitude and despair. "Have I? Or have I just been the invisible woman who picks up his discarded clothes and endures his contempt? Is that being part of someone's life, Mr. Montgomery?" She left before he could answer, closing the door quietly behind her. Later that night, Richard sat alone in his study, reviewing the day's events with growing unease. He had genuinely believed his arrangement with Sarah was compassionate, a creative solution that benefited everyone involved. But watching Ethan's casual cruelty had awakened doubts he'd long suppressed. He pulled out a leather-bound album containing photographs from the past 13 years. In the earliest images, baby Ethan smiled from his high chair, Sarah visible in the background arranging flowers. As the pages progressed, Richard noticed a pattern he'd never acknowledged before. Ethan growing taller, stronger, more confident, always at the center of each frame, while Sarah gradually retreated to the margins, a blurred figure dusting bookshelves, a partial profile through a doorway, present but systematically erased. In the latest photos, she had disappeared entirely, as if the photographer had consciously excluded her from the family narrative. With a sinking feeling, Richard realized that photographer had been him. Across the estate, in her small room adjacent to the laundry, Sarah removed a loose floorboard beneath her bed and extracted a different kind of album, one filled with mementos she'd secretly collected over the years. A lock of hair from Ethan's first haircut, retrieved from the bathroom trash. A finger painting from kindergarten that Richard had discarded as too messy for framing. Report cards, school programs, ticket stubs from concerts and sports events she'd never attended but had found while cleaning. This hidden archive documented a parallel maternal experience, motherhood conducted in shadows and silence, love expressed through folded laundry and favorite meals prepared without acknowledgement. Sarah traced her finger over a recent school photograph, noting how Ethan's smile had changed, no longer reaching his eyes, now carefully calibrated to project confidence rather than express joy. Somewhere along the way, the sweet toddler who had once reached for her with complete trust had vanished, replaced by a stranger wearing designer clothes and her own dimples. Tears fell onto the photograph as Sarah confronted the possibility that her sacrifice had been for nothing. That in trying to give her son a better life, she had instead contributed to corrupting his character. The arrangement that had seemed like salvation in a hospital waiting room 13 years ago now felt like a pact with the devil, with Ethan's soul as the price. In the weeks following the pool incident, an uneasy tension permeated the Montgomery estate. Ethan had delivered a perfunctory apology, as instructed by his father, the words hollow and rehearsed. Sarah had accepted it with equal insincerity, both of them performing the roles Richard had assigned in his ongoing production of Family Harmony. But something fundamental had shifted. Sarah moved through her duties with mechanical precision, her customary care replaced by efficient detachment. She no longer lingered in Ethan's doorway watching him sleep, no longer tucked notes of encouragement into his lunch on exam days, no longer polished his trophies with the secret pride that had sustained her through years of invisibility. Richard noticed the change, observing from a distance as the household's delicate ecosystem destabilized. He found himself increasingly uncomfortable in Sarah's presence, her silent dignity a constant reminder of what his wealth had purchased. Not just service, but submission. Not just discretion, but erasure of a fundamental human bond. The breaking point came on a rainy Saturday in June. Richard had organized an intimate dinner party for potential investors, including James Wallace and his daughter Madison, who had become a frequent visitor to the estate since she and Ethan had started dating 2 months earlier. Sarah was setting the formal dining table when she overheard Ethan giving Madison a tour of the main floor. "This place has been in the Montgomery family for generations," he was saying, embellishing the truth as Richard had taught him for social occasions. "The East Wing was added by my grandfather in the 50s. In reality, Richard had purchased the estate after his success in the financial markets, but the fabricated legacy added the patina of old money that Greenwich society valued." "It's absolutely gorgeous," Madison replied, her voice carrying the polished diction of private school elocution lessons. "Our summer house in Martha's Vineyard is newer, but Daddy says properties with history have more character." They entered the dining room, where Sarah was carefully positioning the Baccarat crystal water glasses that were reserved for special occasions. "Oh," Madison said, startled by Sarah's presence. "I didn't realize anyone was in here." Ethan barely glanced at Sarah. "Just the housekeeper. Sarah, are those the Baccarat crystals? Dad wanted the Waterford set for tonight." Sarah looked up, meeting his gaze directly. "Mr. Montgomery specifically requested the Baccarat collection for the Wallaces," she replied, her voice neutral but firm. "He mentioned that Mr. Wallace appreciates French crystal." A flash of annoyance crossed Ethan's face at being contradicted in front of Madison. "Well, he must have changed his mind. He told me Waterford this morning." Sarah knew with absolute certainty that Richard had specified the Baccarat set. She had written the instruction in her daily. Lawson, but Ethan's challenging stare made it clear this wasn't about crystal at all. It was about power, about demonstrating his authority to his girlfriend. "Of course, Mr. Ethan," Sarah finally conceded, collecting the delicate glasses. "I'll make the change immediately." "Actually," Madison interjected with a casual cruelty unique to privileged teenagers, "I think those would work better. The French set, I mean. They catch the light more dramatically. Ethan's expression soured at having his directive undermined. Fine, whatever. But the centerpiece is too busy. Simplify it. Sarah had spent hours that morning creating an elaborate arrangement of orchids and lilies, following Richard's specific instructions for an understated but impressive display. Your father selected these flowers personally from the greenhouse, she explained, trying to maintain her professional composure. And I'm telling you they look cluttered, Ethan insisted, his voice rising. Madison's father appreciates minimalism. Isn't that right, Maddie? Madison nodded, eager to demonstrate her alignment with Ethan's preferences. Absolutely. Daddy always says less is more in design. Then remove half of them, Ethan ordered, turning away dismissively. And while you're at it, my suit needs pressing for tonight. As they left the room, Sarah overheard Madison's stage whisper. Your housekeeper seems a bit slow. Az would never question instructions like that. Ethan's response cut through Sarah like a blade. She's getting old. Dad keeps her around out of pity. Apparently she was homeless or something before he hired her. Some charity project. Sarah stood motionless, the crystal glass in her hand suddenly unbearably heavy. 13 years of sacrifice, of swallowed words and suppressed instincts, of watching her child become a stranger, all reduced to a punchline for impressing a girlfriend. The glass slipped from her fingers, shattering on the marble floor with a sound like breaking ice. Sarah didn't move to clean it up. Instead, she walked with measured steps to the staff staircase, ignoring Mrs. Peterson's questioning look as she passed the kitchen. In her small room, Sarah pulled her suitcase from beneath the bed and began methodically packing her few possessions. The modest savings she'd accumulated over 13 years wouldn't sustain her for long, but in that moment, dignity seemed more essential than security. She was folding her uniforms when a knock came at her door. Richard entered without waiting for a response, his expression a mixture of concern and irritation. Mrs. Peterson says you left broken crystal on the dining room floor, he began, then stopped abruptly when he saw the open suitcase. What's going on? I'm leaving, Sarah said simply, continuing to fold a shirt with precise movements. Richard stared at her. Because of a broken glass? That's absurd. No, Mr. Montgomery, Sarah replied, her voice steady despite the storm inside her. Because I heard my son tell his girlfriend that I'm your charity project. Because I can't bear to watch what he's becoming. Because after 13 years, I'd rather starve with my dignity intact than continue this charade. Richard closed the door behind him, running a hand through his silver-streaked hair. You're overreacting. Teenagers say thoughtless things. It doesn't mean anything. It means everything, Sarah countered, finally meeting his gaze. It means the experiment failed. It means that all these years of sacrifice, yours and mine, have produced exactly what we were trying to avoid. A child who has everything except compassion. Richard's face flushed. That's not fair. Ethan is a good boy. He gets excellent grades. He's being scouted by top universities. He volunteers at the charity events I organize. Because it looks good on college applications, Sarah interrupted. Not because he cares about the causes. Have you ever watched him when the cameras aren't around? Have you seen how he treats people he considers beneath him? Richard fell silent, uncomfortable with the accuracy of her assessment. I thought I was giving him his best chance, Sarah continued, her voice breaking slightly. I thought watching from a distance was better than not seeing him at all. But all I've done is help create someone who thinks it's acceptable to humiliate others for entertainment. She closed the suitcase with a decisive click. I won't be part of it anymore. Where will you go? Richard asked, genuine concern penetrating his usual controlled demeanor. I have a cousin in Boston, Sarah replied. She doesn't know about any of this. But she'll let me stay until I find something. Richard moved to the window, looking out at the perfectly manicured grounds that represented the life he had built, the life he had promised Ethan. You're just going to walk away? After all this time? What would you have me stay for? Sarah asked quietly, to watch him become increasingly entitled, to clean up the messes left by his casual cruelty, to be the punchline of his jokes with friends who've never known what it means to struggle. Richard turned back to face her, suddenly looking older than his 58 years. What about telling him the truth? You've been pushing for that. It's too late, Sarah said, shaking her head sadly. The damage is done. Telling him now would only traumatize him further. He'd either reject the information entirely or feel betrayed by both of us. Either way, it won't make him a better person. She lifted the suitcase from the bed. Please don't make this harder than it already is. At least stay until after the dinner party, Richard implored, his composure cracking. I need all hands on deck tonight. The Wallaces are crucial investors. Sarah looked at him with newfound clarity. Even now, faced with the collapse of their arrangement, his priorities remained unchanged. Business first, appearances above all. My resignation is effective immediately, Mr. Montgomery, she said, walking past him to the door. I believe that's the standard in corporate America. Richard's hand shot out, gripping her arm. You can't just leave. We had an agreement. An agreement made under duress by a desperate mother, Sarah replied evenly. I've fulfilled my part for 13 years. Now I'm exercising the only control I have left, the right to walk away. Richard released her arm, his expression shifting from frustration to something resembling guilt. I never meant for things to turn out this way, he said quietly. I thought I was doing what was best for everyone. I know, Sarah acknowledged, her voice softening slightly. But good intentions aren't enough, Mr. Montgomery, not when they're built on a foundation of lies. She opened the door to find Mrs. Peterson standing in the hallway, poorly disguising her eavesdropping as dusting. Sarah is leaving us. Mrs. Peterson, Richard announced, quickly regaining his authoritative tone. Please arrange for her final paycheck and references. The older woman's eyebrows shot up, but years of service had taught her discretion. Right away, sir. Will you be wanting me to start interviews for a replacement? That won't be necessary yet, Richard replied. We'll manage temporarily with the existing staff. As Sarah walked down the service corridor for the last time, she felt Richard's eyes following her, not with anger, but with something more complex. Perhaps after 13 years, he was finally seeing her clearly, not as an employee or a problem to be managed, but as a mother making an impossible choice for the second time. She paused at Ethan's room, the door slightly ajar. Inside, he was trying on his suit for the evening, admiring his reflection with the self-absorption of adolescence. For a moment, Sarah allowed herself to remember the toddler who had once fallen asleep against her chest, whose small hand had gripped her finger with complete trust, whose laughter had been genuine and unaffected. Goodbye, my son, she whispered, too softly for him to hear. Outside, rain continued to fall as Sarah placed her suitcase in the trunk of the taxi she'd called. The driver helped her with an umbrella, commenting on the impressive size of the estate behind them. Must be nice to live in a place like that, he remarked casually. Sarah looked back at the Montgomery mansion one last time, its windows glowing with warm light against the grey afternoon, a perfect picture of success and stability. It looks different from the outside, she replied, sliding into the back seat. As the taxi pulled away, Sarah did not see Richard watching from his study window, an unopened photo album in his hands, and an expression of profound regret on his face. Nor did she see Ethan glance out his bedroom window, momentarily puzzled by the departing vehicle, before returning to his reflection, unaware that the woman who had given him life was leaving it for a second time. The Wallace dinner party proceeded as planned, a symphony of wealth and influence orchestrated to perfection despite Sarah's absence. Richard moved through the evening with practiced charm, while Ethan played his role as the impressive heir, discussing market trends with James Wallace and treating Madison with the calculated attention that would please both their fathers. But beneath the polished surface, Richard found himself distracted. Each time a server appeared with the wrong wine or a plate was removed too early, he felt Sarah's absence like a missing limb. She had been the silent conductor of his household for so long that the mechanics of his domestic life faltered without her invisible guidance. The guests departed shortly before midnight, with handshakes and promises of future collaboration. As the catering staff cleared the last of the crystal and china, Richard retreated to his study, pouring himself a generous scotch and collapsing into his leather chair. Dad? Ethan appeared in the doorway, his tie loosened and jacket discarded. Mr. Wallace seemed impressed. He mentioned something about including me in their summer internship program. That's excellent, Richard replied automatically, though his thoughts were elsewhere. You handled yourself well tonight. Ethan entered the room, helping himself to a soda from the small refrigerator behind the bar. "Have you seen Sarah? My grey cashmere sweater has a stain, and I need it clean for tomorrow." Richard studied his son's face, searching for any sign of awareness or concern beyond his immediate needs. "Sarah's gone, Ethan. Gone where?" Ethan asked, his expression puzzled. "Is it her day off?" "No," Richard said slowly. "She's left our employment, permanently." Ethan's eyebrows rose momentarily before he shrugged. "Oh, well, when are you hiring someone new? That stain needs to come out before—" "Is that all you have to say?" Richard interrupted, an edge creeping into his voice. "A woman who has cared for this household, for you, for 13 years walks out and all you care about is your sweater." Ethan took a step back, surprised by his father's tone. "What's the big deal? People quit jobs all the time. We'll just hire someone else." Richard set down his glass with deliberate care. "Sit down, Ethan." "Dad, I'm tired. Can this wait until—" "Sit down." The command was delivered with quiet authority that brooked no argument. Ethan complied, perching on the edge of a leather armchair across from his father. "What's this about? Is something wrong with the Wallace's investment?" "This isn't about business," Richard said. He drew a deep breath, realizing with sudden clarity that he'd raised a son who interpreted every interaction through the lens of financial advantage. "This is about Sarah, about you, about the kind of man you're becoming." Ethan shifted uncomfortably. "If this is about what happened by the pool, I apologized like you told me to." "But you didn't mean it," Richard said. "You said the words because I instructed you to, not because you felt any genuine remorse." "She's just the housekeeper," Ethan muttered, looking away. Richard leaned forward, his expression hardening. "No, Ethan, she's not just anything. Sarah is a human being who deserves basic dignity and respect, regardless of her position. The fact that you can't see that is my failure as a father." Ethan rolled his eyes. "Here we go with the privilege comes with responsibility lecture again." "This isn't a lecture," Richard replied, his voice quiet but intense. "This is a reckoning. For both of us." He stood, moving to his desk where he retrieved a thick manila envelope from the top drawer. "There's something you need to know. Something I should have told you years ago." Ethan's expression shifted from boredom to wariness. "What are you talking about?" Richard returned to his chair, holding the envelope in both hands as if weighing its contents. "What do you know about how you came to live with me?" Ethan frowned. "You adopted me when I was a baby. From some agency, right?" "Not exactly," Richard replied. He opened the envelope and removed a stack of photographs. "I did adopt you legally, but it wasn't through an agency." He handed Ethan the first photograph, a hospital scene showing a much younger Richard standing beside a thin, exhausted-looking young woman holding a toddler wrapped in a blue blanket. "Who is that?" Ethan asked, studying the image with growing confusion. "That," Richard said slowly, "is Sarah, and the child she's holding is you." The words hung in the air between them. Ethan stared at the photograph, then back at his father, disbelief etched across his features. "That's not possible," he finally managed. "Sarah is—" "She's the housekeeper." "She's your biological mother, Ethan," Richard said gently. "I met her when you were 2 years old. You were very ill, pneumonia, and she couldn't afford proper medical care. She was homeless, desperate." Ethan's hands began to tremble, the photograph shaking slightly. "No, you're lying. This is some kind of test or trick." Richard passed him another photograph, Sarah standing beside a Christmas tree in the main hall, a 3-year-old Ethan on her hip, both smiling at the camera. "I offered to adopt you legally, to give you my name and all the advantages that came with it," Richard continued. "But Sarah couldn't bear to be separated from you completely. So we made an arrangement. She would work in the household as staff, allowing her to remain close to you without complicating your understanding of family." Ethan stood abruptly, the photographs falling from his lap to the floor. "No, this is insane. Why would anyone agree to something like that? Why would she pretend to be a servant in her own child's home?" "Because the alternative was losing you entirely," Richard replied. "She was facing homelessness with a critically ill toddler. The authorities were already involved. She would have lost custody, and you would have entered the foster system." Ethan paced the room, running his hands through his hair in agitation. "So for 13 years she's been watching me, cleaning up after me. Why didn't either of you tell me the truth?" "At first you were too young to understand," Richard explained. Then, as time passed, it became increasingly difficult to find the right moment. The lie grew, more complicated with each passing year. A lie, Ethan repeated, his voice hollow. My entire life is a lie. No, Richard countered firmly. Your achievements are real. Your education, your talents, those are genuine. The only lie was about Sarah's role in your life. Ethan stopped pacing, a terrible realization dawning on his face. All those times the way I spoke to her. Richard nodded gravely. Yes, the pool incident, Ethan continued, horror creeping into his voice. When I made her pick up the glass while my friends laughed. I did that to my own mother? You didn't know, Richard offered, though the words sounded insufficient even to his own ears. But you did. Ethan shouted, anger replacing shock. You watched me treat her like garbage for years and said nothing. What kind of person does that? Richard flinched at the accusation, unable to formulate a defense that didn't sound hollow. I thought I was protecting you both, he finally said. I believed maintaining the story was easier than disrupting your life with a complicated truth. Easier for who? Ethan demanded. For you? Because it certainly wasn't easier for Sarah, having to stand by silently while His voice broke as the full weight of his behavior crashed down on him. Oh God, the things I said about her, to her face, behind her back. He collapsed back into the chair, his expression stricken. At my birthday party last month, I told Madison that Sarah was just some charity case you kept around out of pity. I said that right in front of her, my own mother. Richard watched his son grapple with the revelation, remembering Sarah's prediction that the truth would traumatize him. She had been right, but perhaps this necessary pain was the only path to redemption for both of them. Where is she now? Ethan asked, his voice small and vulnerable in a way Richard hadn't heard since he was a child. She mentioned a cousin in Boston, Richard replied, but she didn't leave an address or contact information. Ethan looked up, his eyes red-rimmed. We have to find her. I have to apologize. I have to make this right somehow. Richard nodded, relief washing over him at his son's response. Despite everything, despite the entitled teenager who had emerged from years of privilege, the compassionate child still existed beneath the surface. We will, he promised. But first, I think you need time to process everything. This is a lot to take in. Ethan shook his head vehemently. No more delays. No more excuses. We find her tonight. Ethan, it's past midnight, Richard reasoned, and we don't even know her cousin's name or address. Then we hire someone who can find out, Ethan insisted, a new determination hardening his features. You're Richard Montgomery. You have connections everywhere. Use them. Richard recognized the stubborn set of his son's jaw, the same expression Sarah had worn when she refused to leave Ethan's hospital room 13 years earlier, insisting on staying by his side despite doctor's orders. He hadn't recognized the resemblance until this moment. All right, he conceded, reaching for his phone. I'll make some calls. While Richard spoke in hushed tones to his head of security, Ethan gathered the fallen photographs from the floor, studying each one with new eyes. There were dozens of them, documenting moments he'd never valued and connections he'd never recognized. In one, 4-year-old Ethan sat at the kitchen counter, while Sarah prepared cookies, flour dusting both their faces as they laughed. In another, she stood in the background of his 8th grade graduation, her expression a complex mixture of pride and longing. All this time, Ethan murmured, tracing his finger over her image. She was right there watching me grow up, unable to claim me as her own. Richard ended his call, turning back to his son. My security team is on it. They'll start with employment records, try to locate family members. Ethan nodded absently, still absorbed in the photographs. What was she like before all this? Richard settled back into his chair, memories flooding back of the fierce young woman he'd met in that hospital waiting room. Determined, even when she had nothing, she fought for you with everything she had. She worked 3 jobs before you got sick, trying to make ends meet. She never finished high school, but she was smart, taught herself computer skills at the public library while you napped. Why didn't she have family to help her? Ethan asked, hungry for every detail of this alternate history he'd never known. Richard sighed. Her parents died when she was 19, car accident. She had a younger brother who struggled with addiction issues. The cousin in Boston is her only remaining family from what I understand. And my father, my biological father. College boyfriend who disappeared when Sarah got pregnant, Richard replied. He never met you. Ethan absorbed this information in silence, reconstructing his origin story piece by piece. So all those times I asked about my birth parents, I told you they were good people who couldn't care for you, Richard finished. It wasn't entirely untrue. Sarah is a good person who couldn't provide what you needed. I just omitted the fact that she was still in your life. As someone I ordered around and disrespected, Ethan added bitterly, while she folded my laundry and cleaned my bathroom. Richard's phone buzzed with an incoming text. He checked it quickly, then looked up at Ethan. They found something. Sarah's cousin is named Margaret Fuller. She lives in Dorchester, a neighborhood in Boston. We have an address. Ethan stood immediately. Let's go. Ethan, it's the middle of the night, Richard protested. We can't just show up at someone's home at this hour. Then we'll drive to Boston now and wait until morning, Ethan insisted. I'm not waiting another day to make this right. Richard studied his son's face, the determination, the regret, the dawning maturity that had emerged from the ruins of comfortable illusions. For the first time in years, he saw something beyond the entitled heir he'd created. He saw Sarah's son. I'll have the car brought around, he said. Dawn broke over Boston as Richard's Bentley pulled into Dorchester, the working-class neighborhood, a stark contrast to Greenwich's manicured affluence. Ethan had barely spoken during the 3-hour drive, staring out the window while clutching the manila envelope of photographs. Richard had respected his silence, understanding that his son was mentally rewriting 13 years of memories through a new lens. The address led them to a modest triple-decker house with peeling paint and a small concrete porch. Richard parked across the street, checking his watch, 6:45 a.m. We should wait until a more reasonable hour, he suggested, but Ethan was already opening his door. I've waited 13 years without knowing, he replied. I'm not waiting another minute. Richard followed his son to the porch, noting how out of place they looked, both still wearing rumpled versions of their dinner party attire. Ethan's designer shoes incongruous against the cracked concrete steps. Ethan hesitated before the weather-beaten door, suddenly uncertain. What do I say? Sorry I treated you like a servant for my entire life, but I didn't know you were my mother. Just speak from your heart, Richard advised, feeling wholly inadequate as a guide through this unprecedented situation. Ethan took a deep breath and knocked. No response. He knocked again, louder this time. Finally, the door creaked open to reveal a middle-aged woman with sleep-tousled hair and suspicious eyes. Do you have any idea what time it is? She demanded, pulling her bathrobe tighter. I'm looking for Sarah Johnson, Ethan said, his voice cracking slightly. Please, it's important. The woman's expression hardened. Who's asking? Richard stepped forward. I'm Richard Montgomery, and this is my son, Ethan. We need to speak with Sarah urgently. Recognition flashed across the woman's face, followed by anger. Montgomery, you've got some nerve showing up here. Please, Ethan interjected. I just found out last night. About everything. I need to talk to her. The woman, presumably Margaret Fuller, studied Ethan's face, her hostility softening slightly as she noted his red-rimmed eyes and desperate expression. She's not here, she finally said. She arrived yesterday afternoon, but she's already gone. Gone where? Richard asked. Wouldn't tell me, Margaret replied. Just said she needed a fresh start somewhere. No one knew her story. She took a bus last night. Ethan's shoulders slumped in defeat. Did she leave any way to contact her? Margaret hesitated, clearly torn between loyalty to her cousin and the genuine distress of the young man before her. She didn't want to be found, she said gently. Especially not by you two. I understand why she wouldn't want to see me, Richard acknowledged. But Ethan just learned the truth. He deserves a chance to talk to her. Deserves, Margaret repeated, her eyebrow arching. From what Sarah told me last night, there's been a lot of talk about what people deserve in that mansion of yours. Not much action to back it up. Ethan flinched at her words but didn't retreat. You're right. I have been terrible to her without knowing who she was, and that's still no excuse. But please, if there's any way to reach her, I need to apologize. I need to try to make this right. Margaret studied him for a long moment, then sighed. Come in. I need coffee for this conversation. The interior of the home was modest but warm. Family photos crowded the walls, mismatched furniture showed signs of comfortable use, and the kitchen where Margaret led them smelled of cinnamon and coffee. "Sit," she instructed, gesturing to a small table with a plastic tablecloth. As she prepared coffee, she spoke without turning. "Sarah and I weren't close growing up. Different sides of the family, different states. But we reconnected after her parents passed. I offered to help when she got pregnant, but she was determined to make it on her own. She placed mugs of coffee before them, then sat across from Ethan. I didn't hear from her for years after that. Then yesterday, she shows up at my door with one suitcase and 13 years of heartbreak. Did she tell you everything?" Richard asked quietly. "Enough," Margaret replied, her gaze cool. "Enough to know that your so-called generosity came with quite a price tag." Ethan stared into his coffee, unable to meet her eyes. "I didn't know she was my mother," he said softly. "But that doesn't excuse how I treated her." "No, it doesn't," Margaret agreed bluntly. "From what Sarah told me, you've been raised to believe your wealth makes you superior to people like us. That's not something you unlearn overnight." Richard shifted uncomfortably. "I tried to instill values of respect and responsibility." "Save it," Margaret interrupted. "Actions speak louder than lectures, Mr. Montgomery. You created a household where a mother had to pretend she wasn't a mother, where she cleaned her own child's toilet and endured his contempt. What values does that teach?" The harsh assessment hung in the air, irrefutable. "You're right," Richard finally admitted. "I thought I was solving a problem, but I was creating a different one. I see that now." Margaret's expression softened slightly at his admission. "Well, that's something at least." "Please," Ethan said, looking up with tear-filled eyes. "If there's any way to contact her, any message you can pass along." Margaret studied the boy, who was undeniably Sarah's son. He had her eyes, her determined chin. "She left a letter for you," she finally said. "Made me promise not to mail it for a week, to give herself time to get settled somewhere new. But since you're here..." She left the kitchen briefly, returning with an envelope addressed simply to Ethan. He took it with trembling hands, staring at the unfamiliar handwriting that belonged to the woman who had given him life twice, once at birth and once in that hospital 13 years ago. "May I?" he asked, gesturing to the letter. Margaret nodded. "That's between you and your mother." Ethan carefully opened the envelope and unfolded several pages of lined paper covered in neat, precise handwriting. As he read, tears began streaming down his face. "My dearest Ethan, by the time you read this, if you ever do, I will be gone from your life. This isn't how I imagined our story would end, but perhaps there are some wounds too deep to heal, some mistakes too significant to undo. First, I want you to know that leaving you both times was the most painful choice I've ever made. When you were a baby, I gave you up because I believed Richard could provide the stability and opportunities I couldn't. I was young, alone, and terrified of failing you. The arrangement Richard proposed seemed like a miracle at the time, a way to ensure your future while remaining in your life. What I didn't understand then was the cost to my soul of watching. You grow up calling another person father while addressing me as Sarah, of preparing your meals but never sitting beside you to share them, of tending your fevers without being able to comfort you as a mother, of hearing you speak of me as staff, as invisible, as beneath your notice. I don't blame you for any of this. The fault lies with the adults who created this deception. Richard believed he was being generous, and perhaps by some measure he was. But his generosity came with conditions that slowly eroded my dignity and your capacity for compassion. I stayed because I loved you, fiercely, completely, with every fiber of my being. Each time you achieved something, each award you won, each milestone you reached, my heart swelled with a pride I could never express. When you were cruel, I told myself it wasn't your fault, that you didn't know any better, that one day the truth would come out and you would understand. But I've realized that continuing this charade serves neither of us. You deserve the chance to become the man you were meant to be, not an entitled heir who sees household staff as furniture, but a human being capable of empathy and genuine connection. And I deserve the chance to rebuild a life where I'm not defined solely by my proximity to you, where I can exist as a whole person, not a shadow. If Richard has shared the truth with you, I hope you can forgive both of us for the deception. Know that every meal I prepared, every shirt I ironed, every room I cleaned in that house was an act of love, my way of caring for you when I couldn't do so openly. Perhaps someday, when the wounds aren't so fresh, we might find a way to know each other honestly. Until then, I wish you all the happiness in the world and the wisdom to recognize that true worth has nothing to do with bank accounts or family names. With eternal love, your mother, Sarah? Ethan folded the letter carefully, wiping tears from his face. She doesn't say where she's going, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. No, Margaret confirmed. She was pretty determined about making a clean break. But she left the letter, Richard pointed out. She must have known there was a possibility Ethan would read it someday. Margaret nodded. Sarah's always been realistic. Probably figured the truth would come out eventually. Did she mention any places she's always wanted to go? Ethan asked, grasping for any clue. Old friends she might visit? Anything. Margaret considered the question. She did mention wanting to see the Pacific. Said she'd always dreamed of watching the sun set over the ocean, but had never made it further west than Ohio. That's something, Richard said, pulling out his phone. The West Coast is a start. Hold on, Margaret said, raising her hand. Before you start organizing some grand manhunt with your resources, consider what Sarah actually wants. She left for a reason. Maybe the kindest thing you can do right now is respect her decision. I can't just let her disappear, Ethan protested. Not now that I know the truth. Not after everything she's sacrificed. It's not about what you want anymore, Ethan, Margaret said gently. That's part of growing up, learning that other people's needs matter as much as your own. The wisdom in her words silenced both Montgomery men. Richard put away his phone, recognizing the truth in what she said. What can we do? He asked finally. There must be something. Margaret studied them thoughtfully. Sarah checks in with me once a week. Has since we reconnected. She promised she'd keep that up, even from wherever she's going. I can't promise I'll tell her you were here, and I certainly won't pressure her to contact you. But if she asks about you, I'll tell her the truth, that you came looking for her, that Ethan read her letter, that you both seemed genuinely remorseful. It wasn't the resolution either of them had hoped for, but it was the only one available. They thanked Margaret for her time, and Ethan left his phone number on a slip of paper. Just in case she ever wants to reach me, he explained. As they walked back to the car, the morning sun now fully risen over Boston, Ethan paused on the sidewalk. I can't go back to being who I was, he said. Not after this. Richard placed a hand on his son's shoulder, feeling the tremor of emotion beneath his palm. No, you can't, he agreed. None of us can. The revelation had shattered their carefully constructed world, but perhaps, Richard thought as they drove away from Margaret's modest home, that world had needed shattering. Perhaps from the broken pieces, something more authentic might emerge. 6 months passed, each day marking another revolution in the transformed Montgomery household. The physical structure remained the same, 20 rooms of opulence overlooking Long Island Sound, but the emotional architecture had been completely rebuilt. Ethan had returned from Boston a different person. The entitled teenager who had casually humiliated household staff disappeared, replaced by a young man grappling with profound questions about identity, privilege, and responsibility. He spent the first week in near seclusion, emerging from his room only for meals, his eyes perpetually rimmed with evidence of private tears. Richard watched his son's metamorphosis with a mixture of sorrow and hope. He had initiated family therapy sessions, where both Montgomery men examined the foundation of lies upon which they had built their relationship. The process was painful, exposing Richard's benevolent tyranny and Ethan's cultivated arrogance, but necessary for authentic healing. I keep thinking about all the time she tried to guide me, Ethan confessed during one session. Little suggestions about being kinder, about considering others' feelings. I dismissed them because she was just the help, but she was trying to mother me in the only way she could. The therapist, a compassionate woman who specialized in family trauma, nodded. What would you say to her now if you could? Ethan's voice broke. That I'm sorry. That I see her now, really see her. That I understand why she left. But I'd give anything for a chance to know her as my mother. Richard found himself equally transformed. The CEO who had once believed money could solve any problem now recognized the limits of his power. His wealth had purchased a son but couldn't guarantee that son's character. His influence had secured Sarah's physical presence but couldn't command her spirit. Some things he was learning couldn't be acquired or controlled. They had to be earned through humility and genuine connection. The first concrete change came when Richard dismantled the rigid hierarchy of the household staff. Mrs. Peterson retired with a generous pension, replaced by a more egalitarian management structure. Staff now ate meals together in the main dining room, no longer sequestered in the kitchen. The servants' quarters were renovated into comfortable apartments with private entrances, and equitable pay scales were implemented across all positions. "It's not enough," Richard acknowledged to Ethan over dinner one evening. "These changes should have happened years ago, but it's a start." Ethan nodded, pushing his food around his plate. "Have you heard anything from Margaret?" It was the question he asked every week, and Richard's answer was always the same. "Nothing yet, son." Margaret Fuller had kept her word, maintaining contact with Sarah through weekly phone calls. But as promised, she respected her cousin's privacy, offering no information about her whereabouts and applying no pressure to reconnect with the Montgomerys. The tenuous thread of possibility was all they had, the hope that someday Sarah might be ready to hear how deeply her absence was. Felt October brought crisp autumn, air to Greenwich, and a surprise announcement from Ethan. "I've decided where I want to apply to college," he told Richard one evening in the study that had once been the site of their most difficult conversation. Richard looked up from his laptop expectantly. They had visited Ivy League campuses throughout the summer, with admissions directors practically guaranteeing spots for the Montgomery heir. "Seattle University," Ethan said. "Their social work program is excellent." Richard couldn't hide his surprise. "Social work? I thought you were considering finance or business." "That was the old Ethan," his son replied quietly. "I've been volunteering at that family support center in Bridgeport, the one that helps single parents access resources." Richard nodded, having noted Ethan's weekly disappearances, but choosing not to pry. "There's so much need," Ethan continued, a new passion animating his features. "So many people one crisis away from where Mom was 13 years ago. I want to help create better systems, better options." The term Mom, and Ethan's new way of referring to Sarah, still caught Richard off guard sometimes. But he recognized the healing in it, the reclamation of a truth long suppressed. "Seattle is also on the Pacific," Richard observed carefully, "where Sarah mentioned wanting to see the sunset." Ethan met his father's gaze steadily. Yes, they both understood the unspoken hope that perhaps in this vast coincidence of geography, paths that had diverged might someday converge again. The application was completed that night, with Richard helping craft an unusually honest personal statement about privilege, awakening, and the desire to create more compassionate support systems for families in crisis. No Montgomery connections were leveraged, no donations proffered to influence the process. For perhaps the first time, Ethan would succeed or fail on his own merits. 2 weeks before Christmas, Margaret Fuller called. Richard answered on the first ring, heart pounding. "She's ready," Margaret said simply. "Not to return, not to forgive everything, but to talk." Richard sank into the nearest chair. "Where? When?" "Portland." "Oregon, not Maine," Margaret clarified. "She's been there since September, working at a community college library. The Pacific Coast." Ethan's intuition had been right. "She doesn't want to come back to Greenwich," Margaret continued, her tone making clear this was non-negotiable. "Too many memories, but she's willing to meet you both on neutral ground." Richard swallowed hard. "Of course. Whatever she's comfortable with, we'll go anywhere." "There's one more condition," Margaret added. "No grand gestures. No expensive gifts or job offers or life-changing propositions. Just a conversation between 3 people who need to speak honestly to each other." "Agreed," Richard promised, understanding that his typical approach, solving problems with money, would only reinforce everything that had gone wrong before. After ending the call, he sat motionless, overwhelmed by the possibility of reconciliation he had begun to think impossible. When Ethan returned from school, Richard shared the news, watching his son's face transform with cautious hope. When can we leave? Ethan asked immediately. She suggested the weekend before Christmas, Richard replied. She has time off from work then? Ethan nodded, already mentally preparing. I should bring the photos, he said, and her letter. And maybe just ourselves, Richard interrupted gently. That's all she asked for. Just us being honest. The December sky over Portland was heavy with rain clouds as Richard and Ethan entered the small cafe Sarah had selected for their meeting. It was a modest place in a residential neighborhood, far from the luxury establishments the Montgomery men typically frequented. They arrived 20 minutes early, selecting a quiet corner table and ordering coffees they were too nervous to drink. What if she hates me? Ethan whispered, fidgeting with his napkin. What if she can't forgive what I said, how I treated her? Richard placed a steadying hand on his son's arm. Then we accept that. We respect her feelings, whatever they are. At exactly 2 o'clock, the cafe door opened and Sarah Johnson stepped inside. 6 months of distance had changed her subtly. Her hair, once always pulled back in a practical bun, now fell in soft waves to her shoulders. Her clothes were simple but chosen for herself, rather than prescribed by a uniform. But the most striking difference was in her posture, the careful deference of the housekeeper, replaced by the quiet dignity of a woman standing on her own terms. Her eyes found them immediately. For a breathless moment she hesitated, and both Montgomery men feared she might turn and leave. Then, with deliberate steps, she approached their table. Sarah, Richard said, rising awkwardly, thank you for agreeing to meet us. Richard, she acknowledged with a small nod. Then her gaze shifted to Ethan, who stood trembling slightly, tears already forming in his eyes. Mom, he said, the word both foreign and natural on his lips. Something in Sarah's carefully composed expression softened. Ethan. There was no rushing into embraces, no dramatic declarations. Instead, Sarah took the seat across from them, ordered tea from the hovering waitress, and folded her hands on the table. You look well, Richard offered, searching for a place to begin. I am well, Sarah replied. For the first time in many years, she told them about her journey, leaving Boston the day after they'd visited Margaret, taking a series of buses across the country, finding temporary work in small towns along the way. She'd reached Portland in early fall, drawn by its reputation for progressive social services and the ocean view she'd always dreamed of. I have a small apartment near the community college, she explained. I work in their library during the week and volunteer at a family shelter on weekends. It's not luxurious, but it's mine. My name is on the lease. My choices fill the space. Ethan listened intently, hanging on every detail of this new life his mother had built without them. When she finished, he gathered his courage. I read your letter, he said. I've read it every day since Margaret gave it to me. Sarah's expression remained neutral, but her fingers tightened around her teacup. I want you to know I'm different now, Ethan continued. Or trying to be. I've been volunteering at a family support center in Connecticut. I'm applying to study social work. I want to help create better options for people in the situation you were in. Sarah studied her son's face, searching for authenticity. That's commendable, she said carefully, but changing a lifetime of conditioning takes more than 6 months. I know, Ethan acknowledged. I'm not claiming to be perfect. I still catch myself thinking or saying entitled things sometimes. But I'm aware now. I'm trying. And you? Sarah asked, turning to Richard. Has the great Richard Montgomery also experienced an awakening? There was a hint of justified bitterness in her tone that Richard accepted without defense. I've recognized that my so-called generosity was actually control, he admitted. I thought I was saving you both, but I was really just arranging lives to suit my narrative. It was wrong and I'm sorry. Sarah absorbed his apology with the same measured response. 13 years is a long time to maintain a lie. It is, Richard agreed. Too long. I should have told Ethan the truth years ago. I should have created a household where you were treated with dignity, not as an afterthought. The conversation continued through a second round of drinks, carefully navigating the complex terrain of their shared past. There were difficult moments, Ethan breaking down as he apologized for specific instances of cruelty, Sarah acknowledging the resentment she'd harbored while folding his laundry, Richard confronting his role as the architect of their dysfunction. But there were also glimpses of possibility. Sarah smiled genuinely when Ethan described his college plans. She accepted their updates about Greenwich with polite interest. When the cafe began filling with the dinner crowd, she didn't immediately move to leave. "Would you like to walk?" she suggested. Instead, "There's a park nearby with a view of the river." They strolled together through the light drizzle, maintaining a careful distance that was neither intimacy nor estrangement. At the riverbank, Sarah turned to face them directly. "I can't come back to Greenwich," she said. "That chapter of my life is closed." Ethan nodded, fighting disappointment. "I understand. But," she continued, "I'm not opposed to creating something new, something honest this time." Hope flickered across both Montgomery faces. "I'd like to get to know my son," Sarah said, meeting Ethan's gaze. "The real Ethan, not the heir to the Montgomery fortune. And I'd like him to know me, not as Sarah the housekeeper, but as Sarah Johnson. Your mother, a person with her own history, her own dreams." Ethan nodded eagerly. "I want that too. More than anything." Sarah turned to Richard. "As for us, I don't know what's possible. There's too much history, too many power imbalances. But I'm willing to attempt a civil relationship for Ethan's sake." "That's more than I deserve," Richard acknowledged. "Thank you." As twilight descended over Portland, they made tentative plans. Ethan would visit during his spring break. They would exchange emails, perhaps video calls, small steps toward a relationship built on truth rather than convenience. When they parted outside Sarah's modest apartment building, Ethan hesitated, clearly wanting to embrace his mother, but uncertain if such contact was welcome. Sarah recognized his dilemma and stepped forward, opening her arms. "This is allowed now," she said softly. Mother and son embraced for the first time in 13 years, not the functional contact of housekeeper and charge, but the genuine connection of two people with shared blood and separate journeys, finding their way back to each other. Richard watched from a respectful distance, understanding that some reconciliations would take longer than others. Some wounds required more time to heal. But as Sarah released Ethan with tears shining in her eyes, Richard allowed himself to hope that the family they might become could be stronger, more authentic than the illusion they had maintained for so long. 6 months later, Ethan received his acceptance to Seattle University. The letter arrived on the same day as a package from Portland, a simple frame containing a photograph of Sarah standing on the Oregon coast at sunset. Her smile genuine, the Pacific waves stretching endlessly behind her. The enclosed note read simply, "Some dreams do come true, even the delayed ones. I'm proud of you. Love, Mom." Richard helped his son pack for college that August, both men acutely aware of Sarah's absence but comforted by knowing it was temporary, not permanent. She would meet Ethan in Seattle once he was settled, help him arrange his dormitory, perhaps share a meal with both Montgomery men, if the emotional weather permitted. The night before Ethan's departure, Richard found him in the garden, sitting on the same stone bench where he had once carelessly humiliated the woman who had given him life. "Thinking about her?" Richard asked, joining his son. Ethan nodded, wondering what might have been different if we'd told the truth from the beginning. Richard considered this alternate history, a timeline where wealth and privilege hadn't blinded them to basic human dignity, where a child had been allowed to know his mother's love without conditions. "We can't change the past," he said finally, "but your mother taught me something important, something I should have learned years ago." "What's that?" Ethan asked. "That the most valuable things in life can't be bought or arranged or controlled," Richard replied. "They have to be earned through honesty and respect. That's the real Montgomery legacy I hope you'll carry forward." Ethan smiled, his expression reflecting the blended heritage of two parents who had finally found a fragile peace. "I will," he promised, "for both my names, Montgomery and Johnson." The next morning, as they prepared to leave for the airport, Mrs. Peterson's replacement delivered an unexpected message. Sarah had called the house, asking to speak with Ethan before his departure. Richard watched his son's face illuminate with joy as he took the call, heard the tentative plans for Sarah to help him settle into his dormitory the following week, witnessed the healing that continued with each honest conversation. Their family would never resemble the conventional structure Richard had once envisioned. There would be no Norman Rockwell holidays, no perfect family portraits above the mantel. Instead, they were creating something more complex, but ultimately more authentic. a relationship built on truth rather than appearances, on earned trust rather than enforced roles. As Ethan ended the call with a smile, Richard understood that sometimes the greatest act of love isn't holding on, but letting go of control of expectations, of the stories we tell ourselves to justify our actions. In releasing Sarah from the gilded cage he had constructed, in allowing Ethan to discover his true heritage, Richard had finally learned what genuine generosity looked like. Not arranging others' lives to suit your vision, but supporting them as they author their own stories. They had all been transformed by the unraveling of their carefully constructed lie, Sarah into a woman standing firmly in her own truth, Ethan into a young man questioning the values he'd been raised with.